Welcome back, everyone, to the third installment of my, I guess you could just call it my video diary, as I share my thoughts on what's going on in our world right now with the conflict between Ukraine and Russia. I've talked a little bit in the previous two episodes about some of my observations as far as what's going on right now, which is just history happening in front of our eyes, and how it relates to things that have happened in the past. And I want to do that again today and take a little bit of time to talk about the idea of propaganda. It's a word that we often associate with attempts by governments to mislead, but it's often more nuanced, more subtle than that. Sometimes it's all about the words and how they're used, the terms that are used, the way in which things are presented. And so I want to take a little bit of time to look at how that's been done in the past, and then just share a couple of modern examples that we've seen just in the last few weeks. Of course, propaganda is something that is as old as time. Anytime somebody goes to war or attempts to do anything in the past where they're trying to get people on board with a concept, an idea, an initiative of some kind, they're going to use whatever spin is necessary to convince people of the righteousness of their cause. A great example here in the United States, I grew up here in America hearing the stories about how the American Revolution began. And one of the things that we always learn about in school was the Boston Massacre. It's this event that happens in the years leading up to the American Revolution in which 5 innocent civilians were brutally gunned down in the streets of Boston while simply exercising their right to protest the presence of British soldiers in the American colonies. And that's how it was spun. It was presented to American colonists as the Boston Massacre. It sounds awful. It sounds like something a tyrannical government would do to innocent civilians. But then as you look at the story, you come to realize that it was much more complicated than that. That this mob had descended on the Capitol building, the State House in downtown Boston. There was a group of these young British soldiers who are 3,000 miles from home, and they're armed but told not to fire. And these colonists are throwing ice balls, they're throwing rocks, and they're carrying weapons, some of them, and they're shouting things, trying to egg on these soldiers. And at some point, somebody yells the word fire, and a gunshot goes off, and in the aftermath, 5 people are dead. A lot of people don't realize that those colonists who were killed, they became martyrs, but the soldiers who killed them get put on trial, and they're tried in a Boston court. And the defense attorney was John Adams, an ardent patriot, a man who probably would side in terms of his philosophy of government and his political leanings with the mob. But he defends these soldiers because he recognized that it wasn't murder. And he not only defends them, he gets them off. And so as you look at the real story of the Boston Massacre, you realize it wasn't quite the one-sided, evil British, innocent American affair that it was spun to be. And that happens all throughout history. The idea of propaganda actually goes back much, much further. You can look at ancient tablets sometimes. Folks like Darius I of the Persian Empire had these tablets that were made in multiple languages because they were multi-language empires, just detailing a great victory that had been won by their king, by their emperor, and telling everyone about it. And so this is a very early form of propaganda. You see in more modern times, cartoons became a very popular tool for making one side look terrible and making the other side look like the saviors of the world. And the news became a tool for propaganda. Here in the United States, when we ended up at war with Spain, in the aftermath of the explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor, the press became a key aspect of building up support for the effort to go to war with Spain. And it's one of the main reasons why that war ended up happening. 1914 is the beginning of the Great War, World War I, and you see propaganda all over that. Very early on, the Germans invade Belgium, and the fact that they had these pointy helmets and there were some civilians who were killed by German soldiers gets spun by the Allied powers into showing how evil the German Empire was and how righteous the cause was of the Allies in putting a stop to that evil. Now let's talk a little bit about what's going on in the past week with Russia and Ukraine as it relates to this idea of propaganda. So there are a couple different aspects to the modern reporting that we're seeing as it relates to the idea of propaganda. One of them is the outright suppression of information that's happening among governments. There's some great examples of this happening right now inside of Russia, where you see that the Russian government is actually banning certain terms from being used. Words like invasion, words like war, for example, are not being allowed to be used in news stories. I was just actually reading a news story about that just today. It was actually just today for the first time that Vladimir Putin acknowledged that there have been Russian casualties in the war. And the casualty numbers are another one of those things because as we often talk about with any aspect of history, you always have to consider the source when you're looking at the reports of things like casualties. Going all the way back to Julius Caesar, for example, he always inflated the numbers of the enemy, downplayed his own casualties, inflated the numbers of the enemy casualties. We really don't know for sure what accurate numbers look like, but we always have to question those sources. And so, you know, for example, when you hear Ukraine saying things like, well, we've killed 5,000 Russian soldiers, well, that might be true. It also might be an attempt by one side to make it look like they're doing really, really well, better than anybody expected, and to also let their opponents know, listen, this is your fate as well. So do we know if those numbers are right? I don't know, because we aren't hearing those numbers reported on the other side. Another way that this happens is sometimes by information that we just don't know and nobody knows, and so they go with the information that is going to be the most effective in pleading their case or making their argument. A great example of this is the story that I mentioned in my last video about the men on Snake Island, who very valiantly basically told the Russians to go F themselves before being massacred, so to speak, on that island. And so then a couple of days ago, it starts to come out from Russia, hey, these men are still alive, and we have them. And of course, the other side says, well, this is just propaganda on the side of the Russians. But now today, the Ukrainian Navy has acknowledged, yeah, those guys are still alive. Now, did the Ukrainians know that? I tend to think maybe they didn't, and they probably thought those men really had been killed, but they ran with that story before really verifying it because they knew that it meant that these were heroes that died for their country, and that would play really well at home and make the Russians look bad, which is what they were after. Another powerful way to use propaganda is through the use of imagery. And so that's why we see a lot of images, for example, of civilian buildings that have been hit by missiles, because it helps play into the idea that look at these Russian war criminals, look at how they're destroying civilian buildings, they're targeting civilians, they're not targeting our military. And so that becomes a powerful symbol, showing their leaders in military garb. And sometimes those aren't even recent pictures. There was one that's made the rounds quite a bit showing the Ukrainian president, for example, wearing body armor and looking like he's out on the front lines. But it's actually something that took place, I think, a year or two ago. It's not even a recent picture. But the videos, the social media use by the Ukrainian president standing on the streets of Kyiv, saying, hey, I'm still here. Whatever you're hearing from the other side, I haven't fled. I'm still here with my people. Those are powerful tools of propaganda. And it's equally powerful when it's used by the other side, when you have the Russian president, for example, and this is stuff from years ago, but riding shirtless on a horse, showing showing how powerful he is. These are symbols. These are images that are meant to convey something very powerful and cause people to think or feel a certain thing. For Ukraine, they need to inspire hope. They need to inspire courage. They need to get people to fight. So they show pictures of ordinary citizens, people like Miss Ukraine holding a weapon, ready to defend her country. On the Russian side, it's all about showing, hey, this is not an aggressive, offensive war. We are going to protect Russians inside of Ukraine's borders. And so that's how they try to spin things. And then it's left for all of us to try and decide what to believe and what not to believe. And it can be very difficult at times to do that. So there's that constant game that's going on back and forth between one side and the other. Things like the Ghost of Kyiv, who they now say is up to 10 aerial victories in his MiG-29. And I wouldn't be surprised at all for them to say that the man is going to get one of those new planes that is being given to them by some of the allied nations. And there's another really cool aspect to this idea of how word gets out about what's happening. And that's the idea of protest and how people protest. People protesting in Russia, people protesting all around the world, people showing solidarity with one side or the other through public forums. And we're going to talk about that in my next video in a couple of days. So please stick around for that. But before I go, I just want to invite you to check out my latest original content from my visit to the Somme battlefield in France. I'll put the link up in the description for you. It's a video about the death of the Red Baron as I visited the site where his plane came down the day he was killed. So please check that out, and we'll be back again with some more commentary on this ongoing, unfolding history in a few days. Thanks for watching.